So I mentioned before that evidence-based practice is a term that's used in two different ways. The second way we identified was as a stamp of approval of certain interventions, cognitive behavioral therapy, family reunification, motivational interviewing, sort of community treatment. There's a whole host of them that have these stamps of approval from a variety of different organizations. The first way that we identified, and the way that we're going to be spending most of our time in this class talking about evidence-based practice, is as a process of asking questions, of properly formulating those questions, searching for the best evidence, of critically appraising that evidence, selecting an intervention or applying the knowledge that we gained from that critical appraisal, and then repeating the process in an iterative kind of way where we are continuously asking about the effectiveness of the interventions and our application of the scientific literature. The first step is effectively asking a question that will help us understand and frame the evidence as best we can. So we might have a question such as, what intervention or program or policy has the best effects? That's a question of effectiveness. We might have a question about the factors that predict the desirable or undesirable consequences in our clients. Does poverty produce bad outcomes for children in educational settings? The answer is probably yes. But understanding what the risk factors are or what the resiliency factors are can help us develop targets for intervention. So that's a second set of questions. Another set of questions is to ask about the experiences your clients have. Sometimes we want to understand the world from our client's perspective, from their voice, in order to better identify places where we can work with our clients or to better understand their conditions, to figure out why our interventions aren't working. These are what we're going to call qualitative questions that deal with the experience, the lived experience of our clients. And then there's a whole host of measurement questions. How do we assess and understand our clients, our communities, the organizations that we work with? So we're going to talk about effectiveness questions. We're going to talk about risk and resiliency factor kinds of questions. We're going to talk about understanding our clients' experiences in the world, their lived experience with their voice, and we're going to develop an understanding of how we can measure and better assess the conditions in which our clients live. And those are the four fundamental evidence-based questions that we're going to frame things as. When we ask questions, we want to spend some time narrowing the question down. So we need to think about where the population of our interest is. Is it urban? Is it suburban? Is it rural? Is it in the United States? Is it international? Are there differences between those peoples that matter for us? Does it matter where the intervention is taking place? Some interventions, like assertive community treatment, might work better in urban settings than in rural settings, or they might operate differently in those settings. Who are we applying these interventions to? Who do we want to understand the risk factors of? Whose voices do we want to listen to, or who do we want to assess? So there's the question of what is the specific population? Are we talking about Latino immigrants? Are we talking about kids 3 to 5 years old? Are we talking about adults over 65? Who is it that we want to target the intervention or understand better? And then what is it that we want to do with them? What are the mechanisms by which we are going to improve conditions, or what is the specific set of risk factors that we're looking for? So the standard way of framing these questions are to ask where, who, and what. Once we have a question framed, we can begin searching the literature for answers to those questions. The first research team project is to attempt to evaluate these a website that is a compendium of information. And so you'll get a sense of what we're talking about here. The classic one is the Cochrane collaboration. It was one of the first ones, where they gather up a whole host of evidence. They search in a very systematic way using a systematic review, followed by a meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is a way of statistically analyzing the data that's collected through these systematic reviews. And they compile a whole host of the best quality evidence and then make one statement for what that evidence says. So some studies will say that the program is successful, some studies will say that the program is less successful, but when you combine them all, what does it say? And that's a systematic review and meta-analysis. So we're going to be working on understanding the mechanisms by which you critically appraise and evaluate that evidence, and you're going to do that in one of your primary assignments for this course. So when looking for evidence, we don't accept websites in general as good sources of information. The web is a wonderful tool, but you should not believe everything you read on the web. We do value the peer-reviewed empirical literature. Now, this literature is not without flaws. It is not without a whole host of problems, but it is the best source of evidence we have, aside from these compendiums that collect and consolidate the peer-reviewed literature. So places like Google Scholar or PubMed or Social Citation Index are all a variety of sources that we can use as social work researchers. So when I say peer-reviewed literature, what I'm talking about are journals where articles are submitted by researchers. A pool of additional researchers look over that article, make suggestions and comments, and critique that and decide whether it passes the muster to be published in whatever journal. And those journals are then indexed in the sources that we just mentioned, Google Scholar, PubMed, Social Science Citation Index. The key to effectively using these tools is to find a set of keywords that identify who, where, and what. So you use those question formulations to identify a set of words that you then search in these search engines through the peer-reviewed literature. Or you can just go to these compendiums and see if they have already done that work for you. Once you have identified a number of studies, then you critically appraise the evidence. By critical appraisal of the evidence, I mean you ask questions about the research design, which we will have a whole class on. You ask about the measurement of the independent and dependent variables. We will have a class on that. You ask questions about whether the population is relevant to you or is the sampling appropriate. We'll have a class on that. We will ask whether there's an adequate number of people evaluated in order to make the statements that they're going to claim in these articles. We'll have a class on that. So there's a whole set of questions we're going to ask of these articles, and you're going to be reading a lot of scientific literature, and you're going to be spending a lot of time critically appraising that literature to get a better sense of what is good quality evidence and what is poor or weak quality evidence. Fundamental to this is that we have a hierarchy of evidence. We value, as scientific practitioners of evidence-based practice, certain forms of evidence over other certain forms of evidence. Now, it's important to recognize that the question, whether you're asking a question about effectiveness, or whether you're asking a question about risk and resilience, or whether you're asking a question about clinical or client's experience, or whether you're asking a question about assessment, those all have different forms of evidence that are better. So if you're asking a question about effectiveness, randomized controlled trials or systematic reviews and meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials are the best form of evidence. We'll talk about what those are in a lot of detail in this course. If you're asking about risk and resiliency, you're probably focused a lot more on the populations that are identified, the sampling approaches that are used, and in that case, cross-sectional or longitudinal studies would be the best forms of evidence. Probably longitudinal studies for most of these questions will give you a good sense of what risk and resiliency factors are. We don't really use randomized controlled trials in those approaches because you generally can't randomize people to child abuse or to other things where we want to understand risk and resiliency factors. When we deal with qualitative studies, there's a whole host of approaches that can help us better understand and critically evaluate the evidence presented from our client's experience in their lived voice. And we'll have a class that talks about what those are. And then measurement studies are a whole area that we're going to spend just a brief amount of time, but get a sense of how you can evaluate critically whether the measurement instruments used to evaluate or assess clients are appropriate or good. And so for each of these domains, there is a particular form of evidence that we privilege over other forms of evidence. The last piece of this is that this is a never-ending loop. It's not something that's done, move on to the next question. We are constantly, as evidence-based practitioners, reappraising the quality of our evidence, rethinking its application to our clients, better understanding, developing a better clinical intuition and clinical knowledge by continuing to be open to the fact that we're wrong about something, that we misapplied something, that our clients aren't responding well, or identify areas in which our clients are responding well, which isn't usually our problem. It's usually the negative things that we have a hard time with. But being open and trusting the process rather than being so ego invested in a particular outcome is the ultimate goal of evidence-based practice. And in this class, we're going to spend most of our time critically appraising the evidence, but we should never lose sight of the fact that the true goal here is to develop you guys as effective evidence-based practitioners that are constantly reworking your clinical knowledge to become better and better and better at what you do and serving the needs of your clients.